The Chisholm Mall. I am willing to bet that unless you lived near Duncan, Oklahoma, you had no idea this mall even existed. In fact, 2 days before recording this, I had no idea this mall existed. So come on, let's go uncover this place. 'Cause it is weird and quirky, and I love weird and quirky. Chisholm Mall does not have a lot of information available on it. Yeah, an obscure mall with no documentation. Who would have guessed? But I was able to find something anyway. Not a lot, but enough to help paint the beginning and a few major points along the way. From the notes I was able to gather, Chisholm Mall used to be known as the Clarity Creek Mall, and before that was actually known as the Ward Mall, with Montgomery Ward relocating from downtown to a new shopping center. This all occurred back in 1965, with Montgomery Ward officially announcing its plans to relocate, and ground would be broken in January 1966. In August 1966, the Ward Mall would officially open, and Woolworth would sign on for a later opening in the year. Meanwhile, A&P would sign on in the north end of the mall, while inlines were filled in with the Don Rollins Proprietors, a beauty shop, barber shop, Abby's Woman's Apparel, Schiff Shoes, Fabric Mark, Jack and Jill's, Crib to College, and the Star Pharmacy Company. Obviously it wasn't a very big mall, but that's a pretty good lineup for a small oil town. And there was room to spare. The mall design was also said to allow shoppers to go into any store without having to enter the mall itself, but shoppers would also be able to go from store to store without having to leave the shelter of the mall either. Aside from a few community events like art shows, there isn't a lot that I could find. But apparently by the 90s, the Ward Mall was already dead, as Montgomery Ward left the scene sometime in the mid to late 80s, and Woolworth would only leave a few years later. The specific date I was unable to find, unfortunately. It appears that Duncan suffered from an oil crash and became economically depressed during the 80s. Fortunately, however, they were able to find new employers and bring the town back to some degree of stability. But the Ward Mall floundered and missed out on this bounce back. In 1998, it was reported that a developer from Waco, Texas, Curtis Bud McElhenney, pardon if I'm mispronouncing that, bought the mall and vowed to invest $3.5 million to renovate the mall, bring in new stores as well as a hotel as an outparcel. At this time, the mall was named the Clarity Creek Mall, and when this happened, I was unable to find. McElhenney did, however, announce one extra step among many others, which was to rename the Clarity Creek Mall into the Chisholm Mall. It's hard to tell if this redevelopment plan was successful. It was ambitious, but I can't find any additional information on the mall itself after that 1998 article. I suppose it had to have done something good, as the mall was still open when I arrived, and when I showed up, I was surprised to find a burrito bar, barbecue house, pizza bar, travel center, guitar shop, vape shop, 2 salons, a Mexican cantina, and even a gymnasium open on site. This is such a weird mall that's become a home for small businesses, and I love this kind of weird. It's hard to gauge whether or not the mall is still open nowadays, but I would presume so, as a number of businesses are still listed, with recent reviews as well. I do have to ask though, if anyone lives here, what brings you out to the Chisholm Mall? Do you remember when it was still alive and teeming with life? Please, tell us the secrets of your people. Hidden gems like these are what I live for. We have some time to talk. While we're still here, a few things I noticed while walking laps through these halls for pictures is that you can easily tell where the original corridor was, but it appears that both anchor spaces on either end were hollowed out for more mall space. Now, this part's also kinda obvious, but I will acknowledge that this is a dead mall through and through, despite the resolve of these small businesses. But I'm always fascinated by flies in amber like this. And while thinking about this place, my mind would sometimes drift and wander about what's in some of those storefronts. What's behind that shutter? Did you see the steps in one of the closed-off storefronts? Where do they go? To mystery, that's where. And I think that's what makes dead malls so interesting to me. All these closed-off storefronts create a sort of surreal environment, and your imagination starts trying to fill in the gaps of what might have been. Older games from the 90s and early 2000s have this effect too, but that's a story for another time. Well, before we go, why don't we take a look and see what Area Vibes has to say about Duncan, Oklahoma. Area Vibes gives Duncan a livability score of 64, which is slightly below average compared to the nation, but is on par with the state as a whole. Surprisingly, it gets an A for amenities and cost of living, but housing and schools are apparently terrible with F grades. Crime and employment also need work to shed that D grade. Interestingly enough though, when looking at the summary for crime statistics, they show violent crime at 37% below the national average, while property crimes are 55% above the national average. I think this is an interesting development, considering that if the world according to Briggs is anything to go by, smaller towns in Oklahoma are typically notorious for violent crime. So at least Duncan is bucking that trend in that regard. But for those of you who live in Duncan, do tell me what life is actually like over there. I'd like to know. Thanks for having me, Duncan, Oklahoma, and until next time, this is Doomie Grunt wishing you and the Chisholm Mall farewell, and if it's still open, good luck in your future endeavors. I know the word Chisholm has a lot of historical heritage behind it, but every time I hear the word Chisholm, my mind goes somewhere else.